The transport ship's engines hummed quietly as it approached Nexus Prime Military Academy. Commander Sarah Chen pressed her face against the small window and watched the massive station grow larger. The academy looked like a shining city floating in space, with gleaming metal towers and bright lights that sparkled like stars. Sarah had seen many military bases in her 20 years of service, but nothing like this. Earth's training facilities were built tough and simple. They had thick concrete walls and basic equipment that could survive anything. This place looked more like a palace than a place where soldiers learned to fight. The docking bay was enormous. As Sarah walked off her ship, she saw hundreds of aliens moving around with purpose. Tall, thin creatures with skin that looked like blue glass walked in perfect lines. 6 armed beings covered in thick armor carried weapons that hummed with energy. Small, delicate aliens with huge eyes floated a few inches off the ground, their minds clearly focused on complex thoughts. None of them looked at Sarah directly, but she could feel their stares when they thought she wasn't watching. She heard whispers in languages she didn't understand, but the tone was always the same. Fear, disgust, curiosity mixed with horror. Sarah knew what they were thinking. She came from Earth, the Deathworld, the planet where everything tried to kill everything else, where the dominant species had climbed to the top by being more violent, more stubborn, and more clever than anything else that moved. A protocol droid rolled up to her. Its voice was polite but cold. "Commander Chen, please follow me to your quarters. Chief Instructor Veltar will meet with you in 1 hour." The hallways of the academy were works of art. The walls showed scenes of famous battles from across the galaxy. But Sarah noticed something odd about all the paintings and holograms. They showed elegant warfare, clean fights between organized armies, battles that looked more like dances than the messy, brutal conflicts she knew from experience. Her quarters were larger and more comfortable than any place she had ever lived. The bed was soft, the walls showed peaceful scenes from different worlds, and the food dispenser offered meals from dozens of cultures. But it felt like a cage made of silk and gold. Sarah had barely finished unpacking when her door chimed. She opened it to find a tall alien with crystalline skin that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. This had to be Chief Instructor Veltar. "Commander Chen," he said. His voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Welcome to Nexus Prime. I am Veltar, and I oversee all combat training at this facility." Sarah stood straight and gave a proper military salute. "Thank you for having me, sir. I'm honored to be here." Veltar's large, multifaceted eyes studied her for a long moment. "Walk with me, Commander. We have much to discuss." They moved through corridors filled with cadets hurrying to classes. Sarah saw training rooms through open doors. In one room, cadets practiced sword work that looked like ballet. In another, they worked on tactics using 3-dimensional maps that floated in the air. Everything was precise, beautiful, and completely controlled. "Our academy has trained the finest military officers in the galaxy for over 800 years. Veltar said as they walked. "We teach the art of war, not the brutality of survival." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She had read about Nexus Prime before coming here. Their graduates commanded fleets and led armies across known space. They were famous for their tactical brilliance and their honorable conduct in battle. "You come to us as a cultural liaison," Veltar continued. "The Coalition believes our cadets should understand different approaches to conflict. But I want to be clear about something, Commander Chen." They stopped in front of a large window that looked out into space. Hundreds of small ships moved around the academy like busy insects. Each one followed perfect flight patterns, maintaining exact distances from each other. "We teach our cadets many things here," Veltar said. "We teach them strategy, tactics, weapon systems, and leadership. But most importantly, we teach them wisdom. And wisdom tells us that some fights should never be started." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of fights, sir?" Veltar turned to face her directly. His crystalline features reflected the starlight from outside, making him look like a living piece of art. "Fights with Deathworlders, Commander. Your people have a reputation that spans the galaxy. You are known for your violence, your unpredictability, and your complete disregard for civilized rules of engagement. With respect, sir," Sarah said carefully. "That sounds like stereotyping." "Does it?" Veltar asked. "Tell me, Commander, how many wars has Earth fought in the last 1,000 years? How many of your own species have you killed in conflicts over resources, territory, or ideology?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "We've had our problems, yes, but we've also had peace. We've built a civilization joined the galactic community and contributed to— You misunderstand me, Veltar interrupted. I'm not criticizing your people. I'm explaining why we avoid direct conflict with them. Earth produces warriors unlike anything else in known space. Your people fight like cornered animals even when they have plenty of room to retreat. You take wounds that would cripple other species and keep fighting. You adapt to new situations faster than our computers can calculate optimal responses. They walked toward the Academy's main training center. Through windows, Sarah could see hundreds of cadets working in perfect formation. Their movements were synchronized, their techniques flawless, their discipline absolute. This is what we teach, Veltar said. Order, structure, the application of overwhelming force in precisely controlled ways. Our cadets learn to think 3 moves ahead, to coordinate complex operations across multiple battlefields, to win through superior planning and execution. Sarah watched the training and had to admit it was impressive. These cadets were incredibly skilled. Their weapon work was flawless, their tactical thinking was sophisticated, and their teamwork was perfect. But there's one thing we never teach them, Veltar continued. We never teach them to fight Deathworlders. Because the fundamental truth of galactic warfare is this: no one battles a Deathworlder and lives to tell about it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked at the cadets training below, then back at Veltar. She thought about everything she had seen since arriving at the Academy. The perfection, the elegance, the complete control over every variable. These cadets were being trained to fight wars that followed rules. They were learning to win battles where both sides agreed on how the game should be played. But Sarah had fought in real conflicts where the only rule was survival, and the only winning move was the one your enemy didn't expect. Chief Instructor, Sarah said quietly, I'd like to request permission to teach a class. Veltar's crystalline eyebrows rose in surprise. What kind of class, Commander? Sarah looked down at the training floor where hundreds of the galaxy's best military students practiced their perfect techniques. She thought about the wars she had fought, the battles she had won not through superior firepower or better planning, but through pure stubborn refusal to give up when everything went wrong. I want to teach them what you just said they can't learn, she said. I want to teach them how to fight when all their planning fails, when their weapons break, when their formations collapse, and when the only thing standing between victory and defeat is the willingness to keep fighting when any reasonable person would surrender. Veltar stared at her for a long moment. Commander Chen, you're suggesting that we teach our cadets to fight like Deathworlders. Sarah met his gaze steadily. No, sir. I'm suggesting you let me prove that anyone can learn to think like a Deathworlder if they're willing to try. The crystalline alien was quiet for a very long time. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. That may be the most dangerous idea anyone has ever brought to this academy. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime. Then watch me train you. The news of Sarah's challenge spread through Nexus Prime like wildfire. Within hours, every cadet, instructor, and staff member knew that the human had offered to teach Deathworlder combat techniques. The reactions ranged from fascination to horror, with most falling somewhere between the two. Veltar called an emergency meeting of the senior faculty. The discussion was heated. Some instructors worried that allowing Sarah to teach would corrupt their carefully refined training methods. Others argued that understanding Deathworlder tactics could be valuable, even if they never planned to use them. She's asking us to throw away 800 years of military tradition, said Commander Theclon, a massive hegemony warrior whose 6 arms had never known defeat in combat. Our methods work. Our graduates command the finest fleets in the galaxy. But do they? Asked Dr. Yela, a Zephyrian whose delicate appearance hid one of the sharpest tactical minds in known space. When was the last time any of our graduates faced a real challenge? We live in an age of peace because everyone follows the same rules of engagement. The debate continued for hours, but in the end, curiosity won. Veltar announced that Sarah would be allowed to teach a voluntary class. Any cadet could attend, but no one would be required to participate. Sarah's first class had 12 volunteers. They were the rebels, the curious ones, the cadets who had grown tired of perfect formations and textbook solutions. They came from 6 different species, and they all looked nervous as they gathered in a small training room that Sarah had specifically requested. The room was nothing like the elegant facilities elsewhere in the academy. It was bare metal walls, harsh lighting, and basic equipment that looked like it had seen better days. Sarah had removed all the advanced targeting systems, the tactical displays, and the safety protocols that normally guided cadet training. "Welcome to Deathworlder Combat 101, Sarah said, facing her small group of volunteers. "Before we start, I want everyone to understand something. Everything you've learned about fighting up to this point has been about controlling the situation. You've learned to gather information, make plans, coordinate with your teammates, and execute precise maneuvers." She picked up a simple metal rod from a rack of basic weapons. "All of that is useful when you're fighting someone who agrees to follow the same rules you do. But what happens when your enemy doesn't play fair? What happens when your plan falls apart? What happens when you're alone, outgunned, and the only choice is between fighting and dying?" A hegemony cadet named Torvin raised one of his 6 hands. "Commander, isn't that what strategy is for? If we plan properly, those situations shouldn't happen." Sarah smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I'm here to change. Let me show you something." She divided the class into 2 teams and gave them a simple scenario. Team 1 had superior weapons, better position, and more soldiers. Team 2 was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a disadvantageous position. According to every tactical manual in the academy, Team 1 should win easily. "Fight," Sarah said simply. The exercise was over in minutes. Team 1 executed a perfect textbook assault, and Team 2 surrendered when it became clear they couldn't win. Sarah had been watching carefully, and she wasn't surprised by the result. "Good," she said. "Now we're going to do it again. But this time, Team 2 has different orders." She pulled the Team 2 leader aside, a nervous Zephyrian named Silara, whose wings fluttered with anxiety. "I don't care how you do it," Sarah whispered, "but you're not allowed to lose. No surrender, no retreat, no giving up. You have to win." "But Commander," Silara protested, "the scenario is impossible. We can't win with these odds." "Then change the scenario," Sarah said. "Make it a fight you can win." The second exercise was chaos. Team 2 didn't follow any recognizable tactics. They didn't hold formation. They didn't coordinate their attacks, and they didn't respect the boundaries of the training area. Instead, they scattered, regrouped unexpectedly, used the environment in ways no manual had ever described, and generally fought like their lives depended on it. Team 1, expecting another clean textbook battle, was completely unprepared for the chaos. Their perfect formations became liabilities when enemies attacked from unexpected directions. Their coordinated tactics fell apart when they couldn't predict what their opponents would do next. When the exercise ended, Team 2 had somehow managed to achieve a draw. It wasn't a clean victory, but it wasn't the crushing defeat that everyone had expected. "How?" asked Torvin, staring at the tactical display in confusion. "They had inferior numbers, inferior position, inferior equipment. They should have lost. They did lose," Sarah said. "According to every rule of warfare you've been taught, Team 2 lost that battle before it started. But they didn't accept that loss. They fought anyway." She walked over to Silara, who was breathing heavily and looked exhausted. "What did you do differently?" "I stopped trying to fight their fight," Silara said slowly. "You told me I couldn't lose, so I had to make it a fight where losing wasn't possible." "Explain." "Instead of trying to hold our position, we made them chase us. Instead of fighting their superior firepower directly, we forced them to split up. We turned it from one big battle into a dozen small ones, and in small fights, superior numbers don't matter as much." Sarah nodded. "You learned to think like prey that became predator. You stopped accepting the limitations of your situation and started looking for ways to change the game entirely." Over the following weeks, Sarah's classes grew larger. Word spread about the strange human who taught cadets to fight dirty, to improvise, to keep going when any reasonable person would quit. Some instructors complained that her students were becoming undisciplined, but others noticed something interesting. The cadets who trained with Sarah began performing better in their regular classes. Not because they abandoned their formal training, but because they learned to combine structure with flexibility. They could execute perfect maneuvers when the situation called for it, but they could also adapt when those maneuvers weren't enough. Dr. Yila became one of Sarah's most vocal supporters after her advanced tactics class faced off against one of Sarah's groups in a simulation. On paper, it should have been no contest. The advanced cadets had superior training, better equipment, and years of experience working together. Instead, Sarah's students won by doing things that weren't in any manual. They used their environment creatively, adapted their tactics in real time, and most importantly, they never gave up even when the situation looked hopeless. They fought like they were fighting for their lives, Dr. Yila reported to Veltar after the exercise, not like they were taking a test. The controversy reached its peak when Veltar announced a formal challenge. The Academy's best student, a 7-foot hegemony warrior named Krixtal, would face Sarah in single combat. Krixtal had never lost a fight, never failed an exercise, and never encountered a problem his strength and training couldn't solve. "We will prove," Veltar declared to the assembled Academy, "that traditional military excellence can overcome Deathworlder savagery." But Sarah surprised everyone with her response. "I accept your challenge, Chief Instructor, but I want to make a counter-proposal." The great assembly hall fell silent. Hundreds of cadets and instructors waited to hear what the human would say. "Don't give me one fight with your best student," Sarah said. "Give me 1 week to train him first." The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Veltar's crystalline features showed confusion and suspicion. "You want to train your opponent before fighting him?" "I want to prove a point," Sarah said. "You believe that Deathworlder tactics are inferior to proper military training. I believe that anyone can learn to fight like a Deathworlder if they're willing to abandon their assumptions about how warfare works." She looked directly at Krixtal, who stood motionless in his dress uniform, his 6 arms crossed over his massive chest. "Give me 1 week with him. If I can't teach him to fight like a human, then you win without throwing a punch. But if I can..." Sarah let the words hang in the air. The implications were staggering. If a human could teach perfect alien warriors to fight like Deathworlders, it would change everything the galaxy believed about combat, about humans, and about the nature of warfare itself. Veltar looked around the assembly hall. He saw hundreds of young faces staring back at him, waiting for his decision. These cadets would someday command fleets and lead armies. What they learned here would shape the future of galactic warfare. "Very well," he said finally. 1 week. But when that week is over, the fight will be to unconsciousness or surrender. No safety protocols, no training weapons. Real combat. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Nexus Prime, she looked truly happy. "Then let's see if the galaxy's perfect warrior is ready to learn what it really means to fight." Krixtal entered the training room with complete confidence. He stood 7 feet tall, his 6 arms corded with muscle that could bend steel, his natural armor thick enough to stop most small weapons. In 20 years of training and combat, he had never been defeated. He had never even been seriously challenged. Sarah looked tiny beside him, a small human woman who barely reached his chest. But when she looked at him with those strange predator eyes, Krixtal felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. "Before we start," Sarah said, "I want you to understand something. For the next week, forget everything you know about fighting. Forget your training, forget your strength, forget your advantages. We're going to start from the beginning." Krixtal's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Commander, I've been training since I could walk. I've mastered 17 different weapon systems and 43 fighting styles. What could you possibly teach me that I don't already know?" "How to lose," Sarah said simply. The first lesson was humbling. Sarah didn't try to match Krixtal's strength or reach. Instead, she made those advantages meaningless. When he tried to grab her with his massive hands, she wasn't there. When he swung his weapons, she was inside their effective range. When he used his superior size to dominate the fighting space, she turned the environment against him. Within minutes, the Academy's perfect warrior was on the ground, pinned by a human half his size who had used his own momentum against him. It should have been impossible. His instructors had always told him that superior size and strength were decisive advantages in combat. "How?" he gasped, struggling against holds that felt like steel cables despite being applied by someone much smaller than him. "Because you're fighting the fight you know how to win," Sarah said, releasing him and stepping back. "But I'm not fighting that fight. I'm fighting a different one." She helped him to his feet, and Krixtal was surprised to find that he wasn't angry or embarrassed. Instead, he felt something that had been missing from his training for years. He felt like he was learning something new. "Again," he said. The second day was worse. Sarah introduced him to concepts that had no names in any military manual he knew. She taught him about fighting when everything went wrong. When his weapons failed, when his tactics didn't work, when his strength became a liability instead of an asset. She made him fight while injured, While tired, while confused and disoriented, she put him in scenarios where there was no clean solution, no textbook answer, no way to win except by refusing to accept defeat. Pain is just information, she told him as he struggled through an exercise with simulated wounds that made 2 of his arms useless. Fear is just your brain trying to keep you alive. Neither one of them has to control what you do next. By the 3rd day, other instructors were coming to watch. They saw their perfect student being systematically broken down and rebuilt. Some were horrified by what they considered torture. Others were fascinated by the transformation they saw taking place. Krixtal was beginning to move differently. His perfect military posture was being replaced by something more fluid, more adaptable. He still used his strength, but he also learned when not to use it. He still employed his training, but he supplemented it with improvisation that had no name in any manual. "You're teaching him to fight like an animal," complained Commander Theclon during one of the observation sessions. "No," Dr. Yila said quietly. "She's teaching him to fight like he has something to lose." The 4th day brought the hardest lesson. Sarah taught Krixtal about human history, but not the sanitized version that most aliens knew. She told him about a species that had climbed to the top of a hostile food chain, not because they were the strongest or fastest or smartest, but because they were the most stubborn. "My ancestors were prey animals," she said as they sat between training sessions. "We were hunted by creatures bigger, stronger, and meaner than us. We should have gone extinct 100 times over." Krixtal flexed his wounded hands, feeling muscles that ached in ways he had never experienced. "But you didn't." "No, we didn't. You know why? Because we learned something that no other species figured out. We learned that survival isn't about being superior. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to keep breathing for 1 more second." She stood up and picked up a training weapon. "Every human alive today is descended from thousands of generations of survivors. People who ran when they needed to run, fought when they needed to fight, and never ever gave up when giving up meant death." "But you're not prey anymore," Krixtal pointed out. "Humans are apex predators now." Sarah smiled, and for a moment Krixtal caught a glimpse of something ancient and terrifying in her expression. "We're not apex predators because we evolved to be superior, Krixtal. We're apex predators because we evolved to survive anything. And the thing about survival instincts is this: they never go away." The 5th day was when everything clicked. Krixtal found himself moving without thinking, reacting to threats that hadn't materialized yet, adapting to changes before his conscious mind registered them. He was still the same warrior he had always been, but now he was something more. He was fighting like his life depended on it. "Better," Sarah said after a particularly brutal sparring session, "but you're still holding back." "Holding back?" Krixtal was breathing hard. His natural armor cracked in 3 places, his weapons battered from constant use. "I've never fought harder in my life." "You're fighting hard, but you're still fighting safe," Sarah corrected. "You're still assuming that there are rules, that someone will stop the fight if it goes too far, that your opponent will show mercy if you're clearly beaten." She picked up a real weapon, not a training simulator. The metal gleamed under the harsh lights, and Krixtal could see his reflection in the blade. In real combat, there are no safety protocols. No one stops the fight when you're losing. No one shows mercy to the defeated. The only thing that matters is who's still standing when it's over. "You want me to fight to kill," Krixtal said. "I want you to fight to survive," Sarah corrected. "Because that's what Deathworlders do. We don't fight to prove we're superior. We don't fight to show off our skills. We fight because the alternative is dying, and we're too stubborn to die." The 6th day was dedicated to integration. Sarah taught Krixtal how to combine his new instincts with his existing skills. He learned to use his military training as a foundation, but to build on it with improvisation, adaptation, and the kind of desperate creativity that came from refusing to accept defeat. Other cadets gathered to watch these sessions. They saw their champion moving in ways that seemed impossible, fighting with a combination of precision and chaos that defied description. He was still recognizably himself, but he had become something new. "He's not fighting like a hegemony warrior anymore," observed one of the watching cadets. "He's not fighting like any species I've ever seen," another replied. On the 7th day, Sarah made her final point. She armed herself with a simple metal rod and told Krixtal to come at her with everything he had learned. The fight was beautiful and terrible. Krixtal moved like a force of nature, combining alien strength with human adaptability. He used tactics that had no names, strategies that existed only in the moment, and a fighting style that was uniquely his own. But Sarah had been fighting this way her entire life. She met his improvisation with her own, matched his adaptation with experience, and countered his newfound desperation with the patience of someone who had survived everything the universe could throw at her. When it was over, both fighters were on the ground, exhausted but undefeated. Crixtal looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. "I understand now," he said. "It's not about being human. It's about thinking like someone who has no choice but to win." Sarah nodded. "Tomorrow, when we fight for real, you won't be fighting a human. You'll be fighting someone who learned the same lessons you just learned, but had a lifetime to perfect them." "Will I win?" Crixtal asked. Sarah smiled. "That's the wrong question. The right question is, will you fight like someone who deserves to win?" As word of Crixtal's transformation spread through the academy, one thing became clear. The formal combat the next day would not be the fight anyone expected. It would be something entirely new, a battle between two warriors who had both learned to fight like their survival depended on it. And in the watching crowd, Veltar realized that regardless of who won tomorrow, Sarah had already achieved something unprecedented. She had proven that Deathworlder tactics weren't biological imperatives. They were skills that could be learned, techniques that could be taught, and mindsets that could be adopted by anyone willing to abandon their assumptions about how warfare should work. The galaxy's understanding of combat was about to change forever. The Academy's grand arena had never been so crowded. Cadets, instructors, and high-ranking officials from across the galaxy filled every seat. Word of the unprecedented duel had spread throughout the coalition. Many had come expecting to see a human put in their place. Others hoped to witness something that would change military doctrine forever. Veltar stood at the center of the arena floor, his crystalline skin reflecting the bright lights that illuminated every corner of the fighting space. "Today we witness a test of philosophies," he announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the arena. "Traditional military excellence against Deathworlder adaptation. Structure against chaos. The question we seek to answer is simple. Can refined technique overcome savage instinct?" Sarah entered from one side of the arena, looking calm and focused. She wore simple combat gear and carried basic weapons that any first-year cadet would recognize. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything special. She could have been any human soldier preparing for a routine training exercise. Crixtal entered from the opposite side, and the change in him was immediately obvious to anyone who had known him before. He still stood 7 feet tall, his 6 arms still rippled with enough muscle to crush steel. But something fundamental had shifted. He moved differently now, like a predator that had learned patience, like a warrior who had discovered that strength alone was never enough. "The rules are simple," Veltar continued. "Combat continues until one fighter surrenders or is rendered unconscious. All weapons and tactics are permitted. There are no safety protocols in effect." In the stands, Dr. Yila leaned forward in her seat. "Look at how they're positioned," she whispered to the instructor beside her. "Neither one is trying to claim the center of the arena." It was true. In traditional combat, fighters sought to control the central space to force their opponents to react to their positioning. But both Sarah and Crixtal were circling, staying mobile, keeping their options open. They were already fighting, even though no blows had been struck. "Begin," Veltar said, and immediately retreated to the arena's edge. For the first 30 seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Both fighters continued circling, studying each other, looking for openings that didn't exist. The crowd grew restless. Where was the explosive action they had expected? Then Crixtal moved. He didn't charge like the warrior he had been a week ago. Instead, he approached like Sarah had taught him, using terrain that wasn't there, creating angles that forced Sarah to respond to threats from directions she couldn't fully cover. His attack, when it came, wasn't the straightforward assault of traditional hegemony combat. It was something fluid and unpredictable. Sarah met him not with resistance but with redirection. She used his momentum against him, turned his strength into a liability, made his size work in her favor. For a moment it looked like the fight would end quickly as it had during their training sessions. But Crixtal had learned. When Sarah tried to use his weight against him, he was already moving in a different direction. When she attempted to get inside his reach, He had already adjusted his positioning. He was fighting her fight now, adapting in real time, thinking like someone whose survival depended on staying one step ahead of disaster. The arena erupted in confused murmurs. This wasn't the fight anyone had expected. It looked like two humans fighting each other, both using the same unpredictable style, both adapting and counter-adapting so quickly that their tactics seemed to change every few seconds. "Magnificent," breathed Commander Theklan, who had come expecting to see human savagery defeated by proper military technique. "He's fighting like a Deathworlder," Dr. Yila finished. She didn't just teach him techniques. She taught him to think differently about what combat means. The fight raged across the entire arena. Neither fighter tried to control specific territory. Instead, they turned the entire space into a constantly shifting battlefield, where every surface, every angle, every piece of equipment became part of their tactical considerations. Sarah found herself genuinely challenged for the first time in years. Crystal wasn't just using her techniques. He was adapting them to his own physical capabilities and combining them with his species' natural advantages. He had become something she had never fought before, a hegemony warrior who thought like a human. But as the battle continued, Sarah began to reveal the depth of her experience. She had been fighting this way her entire life, not just for one intense week. She knew how to pace herself for a long fight, how to turn apparent defeats into setups for victory, how to make her opponent's adaptations work against them. 20 minutes into the combat, both fighters were bloodied and exhausted. Crystal's natural armor was cracked in dozens of places. Sarah's left arm hung uselessly at her side, but neither showed any sign of giving up. "This is insane," muttered one of the watching cadets. "How are they still fighting?" "Because they're fighting like their lives depend on it," answered another. "Even though it's just a demonstration." The comment reached Veltar's enhanced hearing, and he realized something profound was happening. Sarah hadn't just taught Crystal new fighting techniques. She had taught him a new relationship with conflict itself. He was fighting with the desperation of someone who had no choice but to win, even though the stakes were ultimately just pride and theory. The end came suddenly. Sarah feinted toward Crystal's injured side, and when he moved to block, she changed direction entirely. But instead of pressing her advantage, she found herself caught in a trap that Crystal had been setting up for the previous 5 minutes. They went down together, locked in holds that would have been impossible to escape using traditional techniques. But neither of them was using traditional techniques anymore. They were improvising, adapting, fighting with a creativity that had no name in any manual. When the dust settled, both fighters were on the ground, neither able to continue, both too exhausted to move. The arena fell silent as everyone waited to see who would surrender first. But Sarah did something that surprised everyone. She started laughing. "What are you laughing at?" Crystal gasped, his 6 arms trembling with exhaustion. "I'm laughing because I proved my point," Sarah said. "Look around, Crystal. Look at their faces." Crystal managed to turn his head toward the stands. What he saw was thousands of aliens staring down at them with expressions of shock, fear, and fascination. They weren't looking at him like he was the same warrior who had entered the arena an hour ago. "They're not seeing a human fighting a hegemony warrior," Sarah continued. "They're seeing two Deathworlders fighting each other." In the stands, the implications were beginning to sink in. If Crystal could learn to fight like a human, what did that say about the supposed advantages of Deathworlder biology? If techniques could be taught, if mindsets could be learned, if anyone could adapt the survival instincts that made humans so dangerous. "The fight is a draw," Veltar announced, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Both fighters are unable to continue. But everyone knew that the real result wasn't about who won or lost. It was about what had been proven possible. Sarah had taken the galaxy's most perfect warrior and turned him into something that fought like a creature from a death world, despite having been born on a paradise planet where the biggest threat was occasionally running out of his favorite food. As medical teams helped both fighters to their feet, Sarah looked up at Veltar. "Still think Deathworlder tactics are just savage instinct?" Veltar's crystalline features reflected the arena lights as he considered his answer. Around him, thousands of cadets and instructors waited to hear what the Academy's chief instructor would say about everything they had just witnessed. "Commander Chen," he said finally, "I believe you have fundamentally changed how this Academy thinks about the nature of warfare." Sarah smiled through her exhaustion. "I told you I wanted to train you." The fight was just the final exam. In the days that followed, the video of the duel would be transmitted across the galaxy. Military academies on dozens of worlds would analyze every second of the combat, trying to understand what they had witnessed. The implications would reshape military doctrine, challenge assumptions about species superiority, and force everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about the nature of combat. But in that moment, as Sarah and Krixtal were helped from the arena, one thing was clear. The galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be a warrior had changed forever. And it had changed because a human woman had proven that anyone could learn to fight like their existence depended on it. Because sometimes it did. 6 months had passed since the duel that changed everything. Nexus Prime Military Academy looked the same from the outside, but inside, a revolution was quietly taking place. Sarah walked through corridors that now buzzed with different kinds of energy. Where once she had heard only whispered fears about the dangerous human, now she heard excited discussions about adaptation techniques, survival mindsets, and what cadets had started calling chaos theory warfare. The pristine training facilities had been supplemented with new areas that looked nothing like the elegant chambers where traditional military arts were taught. These new spaces were deliberately unpredictable. Rooms where gravity shifted without warning. Environments that changed their layout every few minutes. Scenarios designed to strip away every advantage except the ability to think and adapt quickly. In one of these chambers, Sarah watched Veltar leading a class of advanced cadets through an exercise that would have been unthinkable 7 months ago. The crystalline instructor was teaching them how to fight when their weapons failed. Their communications were jammed, and their tactical plans became useless. Remember, Veltar called out as cadets struggled through a scenario where everything that could go wrong was going wrong. The goal is not to execute the perfect plan. The goal is to survive when there is no plan. Sarah smiled. It had taken time, but Veltar had become one of her most effective converts. His brilliant tactical mind, once focused solely on perfect execution of predetermined strategies, now worked to integrate structure with chaos. He had discovered that organization and adaptation weren't enemies. They were tools that made each other stronger. The real proof of change was in the cadets themselves. Those who had trained under Sarah's new methods didn't abandon their traditional skills. Instead, they learned to use them as starting points rather than final destinations. They could execute flawless formations when the situation called for it. But they could also abandon those formations instantly when circumstances demanded improvisation. A soft chime indicated that Sarah had a meeting scheduled. She made her way to the Academy's main conference room, where representatives from military institutions across the galaxy had gathered. The monthly reports had become legendary throughout Coalition space. Commander Chen greeted Admiral Zextar of the Centauri Defense Force. "We've reviewed the performance data from your latest graduates. The results are unprecedented." Sarah took her seat at the conference table, surrounded by high-ranking officers from dozens of species. 6 months ago, most of them had viewed her with suspicion or outright hostility. Now they looked at her with something approaching reverence. "Our concern," continued Admiral Zextar, "is that your training methods may be too effective." The statement hung in the air for a moment. Sarah had heard variations of this worry before. "Too effective how, Admiral?" 3 of your graduates were assigned to resolve a hostage situation on Kepler Station last month," explained General Mordun of the Altarian Strategic Command. The scenario was considered unwinnable. The terrorist had superior position, advanced weapons, and civilian shields. Standard doctrine called for a prolonged siege. Sarah nodded. She had read the reports. "Instead," General Mordun continued, "your graduates ended the crisis in 47 minutes with 0 civilian casualties and all terrorists captured alive. They accomplished this by using tactics that appear in no manual, following no established protocol, and adapting to changing conditions faster than our analyst could track." "That sounds like a good outcome," Sarah said carefully. "It is a good outcome," Admiral Zextar agreed, "but it raises questions about the nature of warfare itself. If any competent soldier can learn to fight with Deathworlder effectiveness, what does that mean for military doctrine across the galaxy?" Dr. Yila, who had become Sarah's closest ally among the Academy's original faculty, leaned forward. "It means we've been thinking about combat wrong for centuries. We've been preparing for wars between civilized opponents who agree to follow the same rules. But real threats don't follow rules. The discussion that followed lasted 3 hours. Representatives from various worlds shared stories of Sarah's graduates performing beyond all expectations, solving impossible problems, and succeeding in scenarios where traditional training would have failed completely. But along with the success stories came concerns. Some worlds worried that teaching Deathworlder tactics to their soldiers might make them too aggressive, too unpredictable, too dangerous to control. Others feared that spreading these techniques would lead to an arms race of ever more desperate combat methods. With respect, Sarah said when the concerns had been fully aired, you're missing the point. I'm not teaching people to be more violent or more dangerous. I'm teaching them to think differently about what violence means. She stood and moved to the room's main display, which showed tactical scenarios from across coalition space. Traditional military training teaches soldiers to apply force efficiently. That's useful when you're fighting opponents who will respond rationally to force. But what happens when you face enemies who don't think rationally? What happens when you encounter threats that don't follow any predictable pattern? The display shifted to show incident reports from the galaxy's frontier regions. Pirates who used tactics that made no strategic sense but were devastatingly effective. Alien threats that seemed to exist only to cause chaos. Criminal organizations that operated according to no known pattern. The galaxy is changing, Sarah continued. We live in an age of relative peace because most conflicts happen between rational actors who can negotiate, compromise, or at least understand each other's motivations. But that peace won't last forever. Admiral Zextar studied the display with obvious concern. You're suggesting that we need to prepare for a different kind of war. I'm suggesting that we need to prepare soldiers who can handle any kind of war, Sarah corrected. Soldiers who can fight with perfect discipline when discipline is what's needed, but who can also fight with pure instinct when discipline becomes a liability. The meeting concluded with a decision that would reshape military training across the coalition. Sarah's methods would be implemented gradually, starting with special forces units and eventually expanding to regular military academies. The process would take years, but the foundation had been laid. As the representatives departed, Veltar approached Sarah with something approaching wonder in his crystalline features. 6 months ago, I thought you were here to corrupt our traditions. Now I realize you were here to save them. How so? Sarah asked. Because traditions that can't adapt to new challenges aren't traditions, Veltar explained. They're fossils. You didn't destroy our military heritage. You evolved it. Later that day, Sarah stood in the Academy's main observation deck looking out at the stars. Ships moved constantly around Nexus Prime, carrying graduates to posts across the galaxy. But now those graduates carried something new with them. The knowledge that effective warfare wasn't about following rules or maintaining superiority. It was about surviving and adapting when everything else failed. Krixtal joined her at the viewing window. The massive hegemony warrior had become her first graduate instructor, teaching other species how to think beyond their biological and cultural limitations. His transformation from perfect soldier to adaptive warrior had inspired dozens of other cadets to question their assumptions about combat. Do you think it will work? He asked. Can we really teach an entire galaxy to fight like Deathworlders? Sarah considered the question while watching a transport ship disappear into hyperspace, carrying newly graduated officers to assignments across coalition space. I think we can teach them something more important, she said finally. Which is? That being a Deathworlder isn't about where you come from or what species you belong to. It's about refusing to accept that any situation is hopeless, that any fight is unwinnable, that any challenge is insurmountable. She turned from the window to face Krixtal. Humans didn't become apex predators because we were born superior. We became apex predators because we learned to survive anything, and survival is a skill that can be taught. As if to emphasize her point, a group of mixed-species cadets jogged past the observation deck, training together with an intensity and focus that would have been impossible under the old system. They moved like a unit, but each individual was ready to adapt, improvise, and overcome whatever challenges they might face. The instructor shouted that no one battles a Deathworlder, Sarah said, remembering her first day at the academy. But that was never the real truth. The real truth is that anyone can learn to become a Deathworlder if they're willing to abandon their assumptions about how the universe works. She smiled as she watched the cadets continue their training. Knowing that they would soon graduate and spread across the galaxy, carrying with them a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. I said I would train you, she continued, and I did. But what I really did was teach you to train yourselves. Because in the end, that's what survival is, the ability to keep learning, keep adapting, and keep fighting no matter what the universe throws at you. The Academy's chime signaled the end of another day, but Sarah knew that what had started here would continue for generations.